Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. This is Laurie Smith on Blog Talk Radio. It is 6 o'clock here in the morning, Thursday morning, February 24th. I'm happy to be here. This is one child abuse survivor to another. I'm just drinking coffee, trying to wake up here. And glad to be able to do these shows, and thanks for tuning in. I appreciate it. Not a counselor or therapist. I'm just a private citizen paying to do my shows. So, you have to listen at your own discretion. I'm talking about abuse and everything related, and it's a very sensitive topic. So, you need to use your own discretion whether you'd like to listen to my shows. Actually, I say this on every show. It's very important. And, because abuse is a sensitive subject, and a lot of people are just, might not realize, that, especially survivors, if you haven't been on your healing journey very long, it can trigger this type of information can trigger people. And as well, it may make people uncomfortable. So that's why I always just say that, you should be aware of what you're listening to. This is all about abuse. And so if the topic makes you uncomfortable, then you need to, turn the show off or go something else, right? And young people under the age of 18, you need to have permission to listen to my shows. The reason I say that is because you need to protect yourself and you need to learn how to do that. And I have a lot of adult content on my shows, and I don't know how young the people are who are listening. So you need to have permission to listen to my shows, a parent or caregiver if you have one, who cares about what you're doing online, and if you, or someone in your life who you can trust, right? Teacher or counselor or somebody, to listen to a show with you and make sure it's something you should be listening to. I really believe in protecting children at all times. And the Canada Regional Director for Dreamcatchers for Abused Children, and this is what we're doing, a volunteer position, but we're trying to stop child abuse and protect children. And so it's very important that you protect yourself, right? And learn how to do that if you haven't got that information, right? Just type into your browser internet safety, online safety for children, things like that, and it can you can check out a whole bunch of websites that will give you some good tips on how to keep yourself safe online. It's very important. So thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We're looking at shame, the issues of shame, and it's from Hope for Us. This particular website I popped a link into the chat room there, and this is from Hope for Us, and she's a survivor, and she has written some pages, some web pages, really interesting stuff on her website, which is www.hopeforsurvivors.com. Hope with the number 4, survivors.com. And /shame.html. It's called Healing Shame, Definitions and Sources and whatnot. There's Hiding Places of Toxic Shame, Solutions Part 1, Solutions Part 2, and we already went over this website really inclusive, like really detailed checking it all out, because this is very good information. And she's covering mainly she's read John Bradshaw's books, Healing the Shame That Binds You and whatnot, and she goes on to talk about what and just her own story, you know what I mean? So, and I'm also listing some stuff from Eric Erickson, psychologist and a psychoanalyst. So, lots of info here. We're looking at the issue of shame and like neurotic syndromes of shame, right? There was identification with shame-based models, abandonment, the legacy of broken mutuality, which we went over already, interconnection of memory imprints, self-alienation and isolation. Shame is the false self. Shame is codependency. Shame is borderline personality. Shame is the core and fuel of all addiction. We went over that yesterday. Shame is guilt. And then looking at the character disorder syndromes of shame, which is the narcissistic personality disorder, paranoid personality, offender criminal behavior, grandiosity, disabled will, and toxic shame is spiritual bankruptcy. So this is kind of where we left off. And we left off talking about the paranoid personality. Bradshaw believes, that's John Bradshaw, Bradshaw believes that the paranoid defense is a posture developed to cope with excessive shame. Any wrongdoings on the part of the paranoid person are disowned and transferred to others as kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy of the betrayal they knew was coming. So we left off sort of talking about that yesterday. Looking at, I was just sort of talking about my dad, because he's schizophrenic, and, he just blames everything other than himself for the wrongdoings, the abuse that was going on in the home, and he blames it on everything except for himself, like the devil. He blames it on the era. Oh, it was the 1960s. That's why I abused, because my parents were brought up on abuse charges in 1967, and so he blames it on the 60s. He says, "Oh, it was just the times." And then I said, "Well, so what does that mean? Like the 70s, the 80s, the 90s? You can't, but in his mind, he justifies that, right?" So this way they don't have to be responsible. If people do that, they put that responsibility off on something else, then they don't have to feel responsible. So pretty sad, but people do that sort of stuff. Offender criminal behavior, she talks about here, Hope for Us. She says the criminal offender acts out in much the same way as he was originally victimized. This is often referred to as the cycle of abuse. Unless we find help and healing for this victimization, we are bound to carry out on the victim role, seek out others who we instinctively know abuse us, or we will reenact it over and over again. Parents who physically or sexually abuse their children were typically abused similarly when they were young, and that's not everyone. Not every parent who abuses their child in any way would have been abused, but it does sort of, the cycle of abuse is an issue, because a lot of people who have been abused do go on to abuse their families and their children, and it's because it's a cycle and they don't get help with it. And that's what happened to my parents. They were both abused, and they just carried on the cycle, right? So it's pretty sad, but it does happen, and that's what we have to break, the cycle of abuse, the cycle of violence, right? Grandiosity, disabled will, she talks about grandiosity is a disorder of the will. It can appear in one of two extremes, in being more human. A person with a disabled will can believe they are the best of the best or the worst of the worst. And Bradshaw explains it this way: as emotions get bound by shame, their energy is frozen, which blocks the full interaction between the mind and the will. Without the thinking mind, the will is blind and can cause severe problems, such as trying to control everything or willing in absolute extremes, like all or nothing, right? So it's kind of interesting to think about. I think that a lot of times people who have these issues going on in their life, they don't even realize what they're doing, Like, even if it was pointed out to them, they wouldn't even realize their behavior if there was anything wrong with it, because they're not connected, something's just disconnected there. They're not able to see what they're doing. Otherwise I think people with parents and other people who abused people, if they knew what they were doing and the pain they were causing their families, they might stop. But that's not necessarily so. But it's just it's bizarre, this whole stuff, like grandiosity, disabled will. There's just all kinds of issues dealing with shame, and I didn't know a whole lot about it myself until I really started looking into it, because I just thought shame was like, when you hear people say, "Oh, shame on you," or shame on your behavior type thing as a child, or that's kind of what I was shame with. I didn't realize it was something that was manifested in my own life or my own self. I didn't know that I had taken on this shame rage connection, right? So I just didn't know what to call it. When I looked at what it was, I was like, oh yeah, okay, I see, I relate to that, but I just didn't know that that's what it was. They said toxic shame is spiritual bankruptcy. Spirituality is about being, and spirituality makes us human. Toxic shame is dehumanizing, and toxic shame creates a life dominated by doing, since it is based on a belief that what's inside is flawed. It looks outward for self-worth and justification. So not just allowing ourselves to be, but just doing all the time to try to make up for that, or compensate, maybe. And I know, I don't know, I have a little bit of trouble with that. I always have to be doing something. Feel like I've got to be busy doing things instead of just allowing myself to be. So there probably is something to that. I wouldn't doubt that. So this website's really great. I hope everybody will go check it out. There's all kinds of links on here to different web pages that she's done, and whatnot. And it's www.hopeforsurvivors.com. So sources of toxic shame, they said the family system. Dysfunctional families, they said toxic shame is an interpersonal problem. It originates primarily in significant relationships. Our most significant relationships are those with our original families. So shame-based families and multi-generational illness. Toxic shame is most often multi-general, and family secrets can go back many generations and can be carried forward generation after generation. And since these secrets are kept hidden, they never get worked out. Shame-based marriage and parental models they talk about here. These dysfunctional families are created when shame-based people find and marry each other. Most often, these shame-based couples consist of codependent adults looking to the other to parent the wounded child within them. And I know that was my parents. I was talking about that the other day. Like my mom, she was abused as a child. She wanted to get out of the home. So when my dad, proposed to her, she didn't really know a lot about him. She knew him, but she didn't know his behaviors too much. I think she just thought, hey, here's my chance to get away from my abusive mother and get out of this home. Right? She was 20 years old when she got married. Left the farm and left my abusive grandmother to go into a marriage that was abusive. So she went from one abuse to another. But both my parents were both abused as children, and they both were probably looking for somebody to take them away from that. and they didn't get any help with their own problems, their own issues. They both had mental issues, mental and emotional problems, and so they ended up hurting each other and their children, right? Because they then became a lot of rage and a lot of hatred for life and for their own lives mainly. They could be happy with other people. They just didn't love their family. They didn't like their family. They didn't want their family. They had friends outside of the home. My parents weren't the type that were just sitting around like, with a shotgun, not allowing anybody to come in or go out. They had friends. They had support within the community. They had support within the neighborhood. They had lots of friends who liked them. People on the block where we lived for many, many years. And even before I was born, they had lots of friends. My dad always talks about all these people that they knew, and my mom always talks about all the abuse that was going on before I was born. That's what she used to tell me when she was still alive. She would tell me a lot about the stuff that was going on before I was born. And their lives were a mess before I was born, and after I was born, it was still a big mess. They never ever did get help with that. And but they had friends outside the home, and they did some normal things. But they just they hated each other, and they used to tell each other they hated each other, and they would never say they loved each other, right? So they allowed this rage and this hatred to tear their marriage up and destroy their children, right? Which was really stupid, especially since the courts told them that they had to get counseling. They were like, you have to get counseling if you want to keep your children in the home. You're going to have to get counseling for your family and for yourself, for your mental illness, for everything, right? And they agreed so that they wouldn't be busted on child abuse charges, and so they wouldn't do jail time. And they agreed, and because my dad had beaten up my brother, and they all the older siblings were talking about the abuse, and so they were in trouble, and they had to agree to certain terms before the courts would let us stay in the home. So they agreed. And they lied through their teeth, and they just continued the abuse on, right? So that's absolutely horrific that they would do that when they had the opportunity to get help. But my mom, she was so twisted and so, I would say rock bottom. You know what I mean? Like she wanted to kill herself. She wanted to kill me. She wanted to kill anybody who was just happened to be in her way. You know what I mean? She was just a miserable, hateful person to the family. Outside of the home, it was really interesting to see how nice she was to the neighbors, how nice she was to the neighborhood kids, who all loved her. All the neighborhood kids loved my mom, and I'd be like, you don't have to live here. That's why you love her. Yeah, because she's being nice to you, but when you leave, you watch what she does to me. That's the whole issue, that she was good to people outside the family, but she was not good to her own family, and that's the whole issue. And that's what a lot of people have a problem with abusers, because they think, no, your parents were great. No, we loved your parents. They don't want to believe the ugly truth. That they beat on their children, that they hurt their children, that they sexually use their children, because other people see them as in a different light. They don't see the abuser. They see the person that. So my parents were able to completely change their emotions, the way and the way that they treated people, just by who it was. So the neighbor kids. My parents loved the neighbor kids. The neighborhood kids, right? And everybody kind of looked to my parents as parents. They'd call them mom and dad, and and I'd be sitting there going, what a farce, what a joke, because as soon as they left, my parents would be battering each other. My dad would be trying to rape my mother, and my mom would be beating the shit out of me, and my dad would be beating on my brothers. Sometimes my dad would be beating on me, and my mom would be in a rage, threatening to kill herself. And then my dad would talk about killing himself. And then my dad would go and try to kill himself in the middle of the night. And then the next day, the neighborhood kids would see him. Oh, hi. My parents would be like, oh, hello. Want some cookies? You know what I mean? So they were completely psychotic, right? Absolutely psychotic. And it's unfortunate that people can't sort of see through that. They knew there was problems with the kids, but, yet they were thinking, well, they got some weird kids, but the parents are all right. Without even stopping to think, they knew that my parents were brought up on abuse charges, because the social workers were always around, right? Well, at least for the first 2 years after they got busted and brought up on charges. And my siblings, the older siblings had a lot of friends in the neighborhood. They all knew, and their parents knew, Now, when I grew up, the social workers were involved when I was 2 until I was about 4. And then after that, parents went bankrupt, and then we moved shortly after that to Canada. Within a few years, sort of slipped out of the system, slipped out of the country. And but all these people knew that my parents were brought up on charges, that my dad was abusing the siblings, because he would abuse them out in pub, out in the front yard, like he would beat them up wherever they were. So people knew how our family was, right? But people don't want to look at the truth, right? So because my mom used to bake cookies and treat all the neighborhood kids nicely, they all thought she was the most wonderful person in the whole world, And I would be like, you don't have to live with her. You're not going to have to deal with her beating the crap out of you later on today. You know what I mean? She was vicious. I mean, I'm talking 100% violent and vicious. So, I shame on those people who turn a blind eye. And people say, oh, well, they just didn't know. Well, how stupid can you possibly be? You know what I mean? You can't be that dumb. It's a matter that it's an issue that people don't want to know. They just want to turn a blind eye, and they just, think that they just allow the abuse to continue. There were so many people that were doing that, when I was growing up, and because they were friends with my parents, so they did not care about the children, right? So thanks everybody for being here. I do have a lot of guests here this morning, and Gypsy Witch, my good friend, and Charlie Spice Show, and yeah, it's great to have you here. But yeah, this is just kind of, it just kind of makes me angry because my parents had a lot of support. And they were good to other people. They were good to their friends, their neighbor friends, and they were kind of almost like, because they were from Canada and we were living in the States, everybody wanted to talk to them and know them because they were different, and it was exciting to meet somebody from Canada, and down in the States there in New Mexico. And so they were kind of looked at as these cool people. In the meantime, these cool people were kicking the crap out of their children and hurting each other, and, they weren't cool. Right, but the sad thing is everybody thought they were, and were willing to overlook the abuse just to have them come to a barbecue, And it's like, it's like they were so dysfunctional. You know what I mean? Absolutely dysfunctional, and it's and abusive. So shame on those people who turned a blind eye and befriended my parents, even though they knew how they were and how they were treating their children. So. But my parents were very sick and twisted, right? I mean, what can you expect? But that's not an excuse. And and that's so many times people will look for, the codependent adults will end up with another codependent adult, another codependent person, and they're looking for that person to help them, right? And I think I was doing the same thing until I was 41. I was looking for somebody to take away my pain. I was looking for somebody to help me. Get over this pain that was inside my heart, and I realized at the age of 41, I said, man, it's going to have to be me. It was like something just popped into my head, and I thought, oh my God, nobody's going to be able to do this for me. It's going to have to be me to do this. I'm going to have to learn how to deal with this stuff. And but until then, the age of 41, that was my very same behavior, codependent, and just looking for somebody else to take away my pain and somebody else to do for me what my parents could not do for me. And it wasn't going to happen. So that's my healing journey. That's when I started my healing journey. They talk about dysfunctional family roles. Control is the major defense mechanism for shame. Perfectionism, family members live according to an external image of perfection, which is impossible to achieve, and therefore no one ever measures up. Blame is another defense cover-up for shame. And they said when control breaks down, blame takes over, and blame can be placed on oneself or others. And like my parents, I talk a lot about that. They were always blaming each other for the abuse, and even in the courts, my mom was blaming my dad, and my dad was blaming my mom, saying, and my mom was saying, "Oh, I never hit the children. I've never beaten my children, not once." And she says, and their father is always hitting them in the head. The reason I know this is because this was all reported back to me from my mother and from all the siblings. So the siblings were older. The siblings were quite a bit older than myself. Age gaps were between 3 to 5 years in between most of us. So some of the siblings were quite a bit older, and they were in the courts telling the truth. And they were like, my mom was like, "Oh, I've never hit my children, and their father's always hitting them in the head." And that was my mom's favorite thing to do, was to bash her children in the head. So it was a lie. She was lying, saying that my dad was doing that, right? And so the older siblings said, "No, our mom's beating on us too." And so the courts were like, okay. And so, she was busted too. And so my parents, and then she didn't want to look like the bad mother, so she cried and broke down in the court, and she was like, don't take my children. And she would tell us this so that we would think she was a good mother, and especially after she would like abuse us, and she would be abusing me or something, and then within a few weeks she would throw this whole thing out that, well, it wasn't my fault, and I went to the courts and begged and pleaded that the children should remain in the home because I didn't want to lose any of you. And she just didn't want to look like a bad mother, see? And she didn't want us. She didn't care about us. Any mother who would make their child sleep in their own throw-up and doesn't care if they're sick, I mean, there were so many instances where I really should have been taken into the hospital or taken into the doctor, and, my parents just didn't care. And so, she just didn't want to look like a bad mother because her mother was a horrific abusive mother who killed her son, one of her sons, right, my uncle. And so, she just played the courts, right, with this, it wasn't my fault, it's all their father, right? And the older siblings were like, no, our mother's beating on us too, and so I'm glad that they did do that, stick up for themselves and actually say that instead of allowing the courts to believe that my mother was not involved, because it wasn't all my dad. My dad was physically abusing us as well, but so was my mom, and my mom was my main abuser, so hugely violent woman. And so it's pretty sad that people do that, blame everybody else, and and even other, and then as survivors, quite often we blame ourselves. That whole issue with shame, guilt, right? Especially to do with child sexual abuse. It must be my fault, or because quite often we're told that as children, growing up in these abusive homes, we're told that it's our fault and that we are to blame, and it's the children's fault or whatever, that the family's all messed up, and that sometimes child sexual predators and within the family, which would be siblings, or parents, or whatever, or relatives of some type, grandma, grandpa, or whatever, they'll tell the child, oh well, if you tell anybody, you'll be responsible for the whole family, the destruction of the whole family, and then I'll have to go to jail, and then or mom will have to go to jail, or dad will have to go to jail, or whatever. And so they place the actual blame and guilt on the child, right? And so many times survivors have this whole issue where they blame themselves too. Excuse me, which is really sad, you know what I mean? Because I never did that, actually. Never took the responsibility on myself because I knew it wasn't my fault, you know what I mean? I was just like, I knew it was my parents' fault for doing what they were doing to themselves, to each other, to themselves, and to me, and to my family. So it's horrific when people take on that blame, that guilt. That I did take on the shame and issues like that, and maybe a little bit of, not so much guilt. I don't know. I don't think so. I don't recognize that in myself. You know what I mean? I never felt responsible because my brother sexually abused me. I never felt responsible because my mother abused me. I never took on that responsibility. I knew who was at fault. They said denial of the 5 freedoms. These 5 freedoms represent a basic human power. The power to perceive, the power to think and interpret, the power to feel, the power to desire, to want and choose, the power to imagine. And this rule denies the true self of each family member. It demands that you not perceive, think, feel, desire, or imagine the way you truly do, but the way the dysfunctional family rules require you to, often a perfectionist ideal. So it's like, not allowing your own 5, your own ability to perceive, to think, to interpret, to feel, to desire, to want and choose and imagine for yourself in your own mind. You're kind of forced to go along and perceive, think, and interpret, feel, desire, and all that. What the way that the family dysfunctional rules say you have to, right? Which is, kind of sad and twisted, but that's what happens a lot of times with children who grow up in these dysfunctional homes, and because the family rules are twisted. So they're not allowed to have their own thoughts. They're not allowed to have their own feelings on things. They have to feel what the family feels, right? And so that's a huge issue, because then later on, as an adult, you almost take that on, within other relationships, whether it's a friend or someone in your life, or even at work. You might be perceiving, thinking, interpreting, feeling, desiring what the boss wants, right? Other than what you want. You might be doing that. Like we could be doing that, right? People who have been through this stuff, right? It's kind of hard to break those old habits. And I know that I was always trying to avoid my my mom's abuse because my mom was so violent. I was always trying to get into her head to see what I could do to avoid the abuse. So, however my mom was feeling, then I would switch over my personal deal with whatever she was going through. So if she was going to kill herself, I'd be like, "Oh, Mom, don't kill yourself," which because she was always going to kill herself, right? And I'd have to go and talk to her, and we'd try. Me and my sister, who was 5 years older than me, we'd go and try to help my mom feel better. We'd be like, "Don't kill yourself," In the meantime, as a child, did I really care that my mom was sitting there telling me that she was going to kill herself? No, I really didn't, because I didn't have a bond with my mother, right? There was no nurturing, there was no love, no care, no concern, and there was a whole lot of abuse. So it's not that I actually cared whether she killed herself or not, but I was trying to avoid the abuse. So I would be like, I'd always try to be on her side. So no matter what was going on, I'd just play the game. You know what I mean? And I knew it was a game. I knew I was playing the game. I had to play the game with everybody in my family because they were all so sick and twisted that you develop these safety mechanisms. So my dad, I actually avoided my dad. He was schizophrenic, psychotic, and was quite often talking about killing the whole family, killing us. And he was physically abusive towards me, he was not I don't think he was responsible for any sexual abuse towards me except for ogling and this type of stuff. My brother was my main, abused me sexually, right? But my dad was very abusive physically to all the children, right? So, and emotionally, psychologically. So, verbally, he didn't curse us like my mom. My mom was verbally abusive as well as a violent woman. So when my mom was talking about killing herself, I would be like, "Don't kill yourself, Mom," we're trying to get into her on her good side. See, so I was always, looking to stay on her good side, and really didn't care whether she killed herself or not. I certainly didn't want her to die. You know what I mean? As a young kid, I didn't want to be raised by my dad. Not a big issue. We were all trying to keep my mom alive, even though she was our main physical abuser, especially me. Nobody wanted my mom to die because we didn't want to be raised by my dad because he was so psychotic. He tried to drive me and my sister over a cliff one time. He was going to commit suicide with us, and I don't know what stopped him because I was pretty young, and my sister was older, 5 years older. She went and told my mom that my dad was going to drive us over a cliff in the mountains, and that. And then my mom was like, "Well, you can't drive with him anymore by yourself," so she wouldn't let us get in the car with him anymore by ourselves. So I think I was probably 4 or 5 years old. Because I remember being in the car with him another time where he was going to drive to California, just me and him. He says, we'll leave your mother, and we'll go to California, just me and you, right? And I was like, I'm jumping out of the car, and I remember this. I actually opened up the door and was ready to jump out. And I said, "If you don't turn around, I'm going to jump out." So I was really young. And I totally remember that because I was like, "No way are you raising me, you crazy dude." He was absolutely out of his mind. And but the abuse that I was suffering at my mom's hand was not good either. And so this kind of stuff, is absolutely horrific. So that's why even as an adult I have issues trying to have my own feelings, perceive things and think and feel my own stuff when I'm in a relationship with somebody, whether it's a working, like co-worker relationship, whether it's, and mainly it's a boss issue. So like anybody who has authority over me, I tend to want to work really hard to stay on their good side, and it probably goes all the way back to my taking on that behavior to save myself from abuse in the home. So I think that I still sort of do that in my adult life with people who are in positions of authority over me. I actually try not to do it now because I realized I was doing it a few years ago and working through this, right? So I don't tend to do that anymore. But anyway, this is a great website. Check this out, www.hopeforsurvivors.com. The next portion is like the no talk rule, don't make mistakes rule, unreliability. So we'll talk about this stuff tomorrow. So have a great day. I'll be back on tonight on Dreamcatchers Talk Radio, here on Blog Talk Radio, and then tomorrow morning, same time, same place, one child to be a survivor to another. And, just make sure that you get some help. And if you need, thanks everybody for being here. I really appreciate it. And, if you need any information that I might have, please let me know, and I can try to find it for you. I have lots of info and whatnot regarding child abuse and, survivor manuals, just from what I've found out there. So make sure, you hang on and, don't allow yourself to go down, and to destroy your life because of the abuse that you suffered. That's my big message, It's like, we certainly deserved a whole lot better, and we do. But is somebody else going to be able to do it for us? Probably not. And so, really, it is up to us to get the help that we need, whether it's a counselor, a therapist, or group support, or finding a good friend to talk to, or, finding, calling a crisis line, man. I mean, if you can't cope, you call a crisis line, right? Like, you just do whatever you can do, and, to keep yourself alive, because you do count, and you do matter. You matter to me, or I wouldn't be doing this show. So thanks, everybody, for being here. Appreciate it. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.